So, why are we all here today? We're here today to talk about energy. Britain has some of the highest industrial energy costs in Europe. We have some of the most interesting ways of extracting energy and some of the most interesting ways of importing it that might be somewhat counterintuitive. And to talk more about that today is our lovely speaker, Lord MacKinlay. Lord MacKinlay was a former Conservative MP for South Thanet, and then he ascended to the Lords to become Lord MacKinlay, and he's recently become the director of the Global Warming Policy Foundation. Everyone, can you give a warm welcome to Lord MacKinlay? Thank you so much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you to Jasper. We had a chance encounter at Victoria Station. He said, "Oh, would you speak?" And I went, "Oh, yeah, okay, of course." So here we are. I've done a number of what you might call complicated campaigns in life. I really started politics with concerns about Britain's membership of the European Union. I wanted Brexit. So having achieved that, I could have sort of gone into the wilderness, gone back to being a chartered accountant, retired on a beach to Thailand or something. But no, I think the net zero issue is actually bigger than Brexit. Because if we don't get this right, we don't have a country with growth and wealth to do all the things that we want. Now, I'm not going to particularly talk about the science of it, because it's settled, isn't it? The science is settled. I have got a science degree, and then I became a chartered accountant, chartered tax advisor. But I do pose that question, is it so beyond a reasonable doubt that the science is so completely settled we do not want to talk about it anymore? In the 1970s, some in the room, I think, did see the 1970s. I'm looking at one just here. I did as well. I was a young lad in shorts, and we were told that the Ice Age was coming, and that was the settled science those days. So yeah, the science is settled. And I just put to you the reasonable doubt things. If CO2 is good at 1 part in 3,500 in the atmosphere, how come it's suddenly completely cataclysmic at 1 part in 2,500 parts in the atmosphere? Enough to make, we think, would be wise people like Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, to actually claim that we're going to all boil in a bag and global boiling. So that's my one slight concern. The other one is our climate just man-made CO2? Nothing else. There is nothing else going on. Doesn't matter what the clouds are doing, the sun is doing, what volcanoes are doing, what water vapours in the atmosphere, how much greening there is, how many, the state of the ice caps. None of that matters. It's just man-made CO2 and nothing else. And the other bit that concerns me is if UK reduces to net zero, all will be well. Our 0.8% is going to make all the difference. So, have I got a little bit of a doubt? I've got enough of a reasonable doubt not to be spending literally trillions of pounds on this endeavour without a bit more work. But I think we'd all agree that the world chucking out 40 billion tonnes of CO2 a year cannot be good. Cannot be good. And also, fossil fuels are finite, and mankind one day will have to find alternative sources of energy. That is clear, that is obvious. But for a country to be successful, I say there are 4 things. Some things that you really shouldn't do. Have massive bureaucracy, have massive red tape. That's not a good thing if you want growth. High wage costs are not always great for growth, but you can have it, obviously, and we like those things, as long as those high wages actually buy stuff. We can have very costly land and very restrictive planning restrictions. You can have that, of course. And you can have very expensive energy. Now, America, the US, has gone up the route of, it's got pretty high bureaucracy, no doubt about that, it's got very high wage costs. But the other 2 things, land and planning and certainly energy costs, are low. China doesn't do hardly any of those things. It probably has got a high bureaucracy, and you've got to grease a few palms to get things done. But the other 3 are cheap. Uniquely, this country has got all 4 off the scale. And if we think that that can ever be a recipe for growth, then we are in cuckoo land. But how do we get to this consensus on where we're going? It's sort of grown upon us, this cosy consensus. The COP meetings that have been going on, we're now on the sort of the 29th. And of course, we have kidded ourselves in this country. We adopted the Climate Change Act in 2008, and it all sounded fairly benign and all rather nice on the back of these COP conferences. And then Theresa May, during the height of the Brexit wars, when none of us were looking, crept up our requirement for reducing CO2 from 80%, perhaps doable, although expensive, to the full 100%. And even the Climate Change Committee, a committee that I don't usually have too much to do with, even they acknowledge that that will double the cost of these endeavours. So COP29, what happened at COP29? Well, of course, the UK sent 470 attendees to Baku. I have got no idea what 470 civil servants would do in a week in Baku. And I asked a question in the House of Lords recently, and even the leader of the House of Lords wasn't really sure what they'd done either. But the one thing that came out of that conference is by 2035, the world, or the developed world, has agreed at that conference $300 billion a year of transfers to the developing world, so they don't go up the route of using fossil fuels as we did in our growth years. 300 billion a year, every year. Now, I further probed the leader of the House of Lords and said, how much are we on the hook for? Because I'd have thought that's quite important. In 10 years' time, one of the bigger economies of the world, fifth, sixth, whichever one you fancy reckoning, how much of that 300 billion are we on the hook for? Answer, there is none. They do not know, they will not say. So this is the background of where we are. And of course China is not on the hook for any of this because it claims that it is still a developing country. What have we done for UK energy in this country? Well, we're committed to spending £250 billion fairly shortly in the next few years to decarbonise our economy, and that is just to save £7 billion worth of gas that goes into creating electricity. So in my mind, thinking back as I still am chartered accountant, 250 billion investment to save £7 billion worth of gas. Who would take that up as an investment? Who's willing to invest even £250 to get £7 back? It's not an investment anyone would make. Just as we're importing gas and oil on a global massive scale, we're actually not allowing any new gas and oil licences in the North Sea. And there's still a fair bit out there to be gained in Rosebank and Jackdaw. And of course, we haven't even started to think about the potential for fracking. And just this week, perhaps today, but certainly tomorrow, our only two trial frack wells that have sat there doing not a lot for some time because of general outrage that has been created, are going to be concreted in, finally, for good, sorted into the earth, no matter that they may be able to be useful in the future, potentially if there is an energy crisis, which I think we're on the verge of. But our government has said these must be concreted in for good. And the company concerned, Quadrilla, are quite happy to pay the licence, pay the security costs and everything else that goes along with these two test wells, £1 million a year, quite happy just to leave them there. Ad infinitum until maybe a time comes where we come to our senses. We haven't even started on the planning yet. The pylons that are going to go across this country to connect up small farms of wind and solar. And we haven't even started to have that row in the beautiful parts of this country. I mean, I'm in Kent, it's fairly built up, but certainly across Norfolk, Suffolk and Lincolnshire are going to suffer that. The government is now directing for the first time, I mean, you cannot believe you're actually living in a capitalist country. They're directing how many cars we must buy of a certain type. They're directing what type of boilers or heating instruments we are to have in our home. I mean, to me, last time I looked, I didn't need to be told to buy a smartphone. I bought it because it was better than a Nokia flip phone. And if they can prove that an electric vehicle or a heat pump is better than a gas boiler or a traditional car, we'll all buy them. But they're not going up that route. They're forcing us to make decisions. But we're importing gas at wholesale. We're currently spending 30 billion a year with Norway, so they can just add to their biggest pile of sovereign wealth on the planet. We're currently spending 10 billion a year with Qatar. My worry is we're going to run out of football clubs for them to buy. And we are spending, or will be, after baby drill really gets off the ground, we'll be spending 10 billion a year in the US. We even imported, a couple of years ago, an LNG gas ship from Australia. And we call this sort of a green way of supplying gas. It couldn't be worse. And of course, all of us are spending out on keeping this madness going. There's a £7 billion subsidy that we've so far paid to Drax power stations. Now, this is something that I think unites everybody, even if you're a Greenpeace supporter. How can it be right that we cut down virgin forest in the USA? It gets probably with, I can imagine, a chainsaw driven by a fossil fuel, no doubt. It then gets put onto a lorry to a factory for it to be chipped and put into pellets and dried, all done by fossil fuels. And then it will go on a diesel-powered train across the US to a port, and it will be loaded onto a ship, diesel-powered, and come to the UK to be burnt in a power station, generating 4 times as much CO2 per kilowatt hour of the stuff you wanted, i.e. electricity, than gas. And that accounts for 0 on our balance sheet of CO2. And the replacement time of a lot of that forest can be up to 150, 170 years. So we're being told that CO2 is the bogeyman, and yet to get energy today, we're willing to create a scheme of producing 4 times as much for the energy we want than the alternative being gas. And it is 0 on the balance sheet of the UK's CO2. I mean, this is the lunacy that we've descended to. And Desnes actually wants to do more of this because it is the only guaranteed source of energy. As we get more renewables, we get more unreliability. We've got the balance of our nuclear power stations turning off, and I can foresee a year or two before the new ones come on stream because of the delays. We could end up being barren of nuclear for a couple of years. We've closed down the last of the coal, and we've got just gas stations on standby. So the government is reaching for more of the Drax style because it's energy you can rely on. And that, to me, I think it just epitomises the chaos that we're in. But the myriad of support, of contracts for difference, for subsidies, for constraint payments, now amounts to £17 billion a year, paid for on all of our bills. Now, at a time of cost of living problems, I would have thought the people in this country would rather have that 17 billion in their pockets to be spending on things they want to spend on, not the essential that they reluctantly spend on, i.e. heat and light, that we'd all rather get for the lowest possible price. And we're going to increasingly rely on people abroad by interconnectors. Now, is that at all sensible to rely, particularly in the winter, on interconnectors when you have things like dunkelflauters? Now, we've got some new words in the lexicon. I love the word dunkelflauter. It's where, German word, where you have absolutely no wind in the depths of winter. So we've got very little solar happening because it's winter. You've got absolutely no wind turning because you've got a dunkelflauter at a high pressure zone across the whole of Northern Europe. So there isn't a wind turbine going in Denmark or Germany or Britain or anywhere else. So we're all relying or hoping to get some interconnector energy from Norway, from their hydropower, or from the French nuclear system. Now, there's not enough of this energy to go round, and yet this is the new solution to our intermittency. And we're told that renewables, how often have we heard this? Now, I did a radio show just yesterday morning on LBC, and the green that they turned out said, but renewables are cheap. They're the cheapest form of energy. Well, they may be if you had the most perfect day of wind going at 20 miles an hour, and you've got all of that wind being used by all of us in perfect harmony. On a day like that of absolute perfection, it might just be slightly cheaper. But when the wind doesn't blow, you've got to do other things. Now, we've got a choice. We can create hydrogen. I was talking to someone in the room about hydrogen. We could pump some water uphill and then let it flow through as hydropower when the wind doesn't blow. Or we can go up the route of batteries. Now, batteries, to me, are the worst of the worst. You're into a supply chain run by China. You're into digging up vast tracts of Africa and South America. And I often say we really do need to stop funding birth control in the Democratic Republic of Congo, because we're going to need those children to dig up the cobalt. I mean, this is what we've got into. And by the way, the batteries only last about 12 years, and you've got to do it all over again. So what does all this cost? I mean, just for California, they've done the study. California is not a dissimilar size economy to the whole of the UK. It would require $16 trillion worth of batteries to actually have the backup required. And you'd have to bulk up, obviously, the renewables. A lot more solar than you think you need on a good day, a lot more wind than you think you need on a good day, because you've got to account for the times when the wind doesn't blow and the sun isn't doing all that it should. It would cost $16 trillion in just California. So that's over 3 times the GDP of the UK. And that would last 12 years. And then you've got to do it all over again. And you've got to dispose of those quite toxic batteries. And you've got to dig up the stuff to make the batteries. I mean, if that is a green solution, I'd hate to see an ungreen one. And you only have to look at where our CO2 output is. I mean, you get to the state of, well, why are we bothering? Why is our 0.8% of any relevance at all? You look at the chart of where China is, and it is going off the scale, more than 30% of global CO2. And India hasn't even started yet. And Indonesia hasn't really started yet. And most of Africa hasn't even started yet. So Britain's 0.8% of global CO2, even if we did nothing else and just continued as we are, will become an ever smaller percentage. But we're being told that if Britain does it, all will be well and climate change will be held at bay. And is it any wonder, with those energy prices that we've created, some 4 times higher than the US, some 10 times higher than coal-fueled China, is it any wonder that we're no longer producing steel, we're no longer producing ammonia, and just recently we've started the destruction and the export of Staffordshire pottery. They're literally dismantling the factories, taking them to China, reassembling them, making the pottery on the back of cheap coal, and then we stick them back on a diesel-powered ship to come back to the UK, and that's zero carbon. And that's what we've become. Fossil fuel use is increasing every year. Over the last 10 years, the JP Morgan 2025 annual energy report has actually said that fossil fuel use has increased by 15% over the last 10 years. And you know what? This has been a real week for energy, because for the first time we've had that little chink, that little consensus has started to collapse with Kemi's speech just yesterday. I don't care if you're Conservative voters or Reform voters or Labour voters, this is the first time that the cosy consensus that COP is true and everything must flow and we must get to net zero no matter what has suddenly been broken apart, where a potential party of government is now questioning very seriously whether this pathway is affordable, whether it's desirable, whether it can actually be done, and whether we actually want to live the type of life that would be required on the back of it. Because the rest of the world has given up on net zero. Net zero is the stuff of yesteryear around most of the world. It's just Britain particularly, and Denmark. What have Britain and Denmark got in common? The highest amount of wind turbines and renewables, and we've both of us got the highest price of electricity. And we haven't even started to substitute gas and oil in the energy system for electricity, because electricity only accounts for about 20% of what we use. So what's the answer? And this was the question that was posed by tonight. Cheap and abundant. Britain is quite blessed as countries go. It was once called an island of coal surrounded by a sea of fish. We managed to stop the coal and we've given the fish away. But we have still got a lot of gas. If Norway is drawing out of the same basin of the North Sea, why have we turned the taps off of that available basin? And I discussed what Quadrilla were trying to do for this country, trying to tap into the Boland Shale. And by all accounts from American geologists, they say the Boland Shale could be one of the most desirable shale deposits in Europe, if not the world. Deeper, better, and very productive. But we're not even prepared to give it a look, to give it a try. But to me, it may not be the answer, but maximising domestic supply has got to be better than importing, because domestic supply means jobs, it means investments, it means an awful lot of tax, and it also is a big balance of payment saving. To me, that is more than a holy trinity. There's 4 good things there to like. So why aren't we going up that route to do so? And also, by saving all of that money, raising the tax and not spending that money abroad, we may be able to put some proper money into developing a new type of nuclear reactor. The small modular reactor has been talked about for a very long time. And Rolls-Royce have got a very operational model. We've been using them in submarines since the 1960s. If we could crack a good small modular reactor, we could put them on the sites of old coal-powered stations, so you could then reuse those assets of existing power lines, so they're not stranded anymore, they're actually come back to use, and we could potentially have one of the biggest export models of production that this country has seen for a very long time. So if we want cheap and abundant, it has to be domestic gas moving in the longer term, if we still convince ourselves that the whole net zero pathway is worth doing while the rest of the world does nothing. We could still achieve it by moving on to small modular reactors. But this government, frankly, is not going to do it. It needs us and people and discussion and think tanks and pressure to actually get us back on track for UK energy. But thank you for listening. It's been an absolute pleasure.